Erin O'Toole, as I mentioned, is the leader of the Conservative Party. He's in the foyer of the West Block here in Ottawa on Parliament Hill. Hi, Mr. O'Toole. Good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
Good to be with you.
You called this budget, I heard in your press conference following it, or your remarks following it, a letdown for Canadians and an election budget. You specifically targeted what you said was no real plan to help recover jobs, for example, or help recover some of the negative effects on people's financial fortunes during this pandemic. But which recovery measures specifically, like what specifically in this budget would you not pursue?
Well, look, it's the first budget in 2 years. It's a budget in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a third wave where crises in Ontario and other provinces are reaching the worst levels of the entire pandemic. There's no plan for that. There's also very little to actually secure jobs for some of the small businesses in crisis, young people. Internships for young people is not a plan for an economic recovery. We need a serious plan. That's what I recommended to Mr. Trudeau. And the debt levels they're putting in here are astronomical and are going to actually squeeze out programs in the future, particularly if we see inflation and interest rates change. So the gargantuan spending commitments, no plan for a private sector-led recovery, and then programs that in many cases the Liberals have promised multiple times before. So it missed the mark entirely for a budget that should be about securing our economy coming out of COVID. We're all disappointed to see that we don't have the vaccines, say, that they have in the United States. But how are we going to try and lead the world in the economic recovery instead of lagging the world?
Are you being accurate, though, for example, in saying that they're not addressing some of the issues that have come to light during the pandemic? I mean, they're extending, for example, the wage and rent subsidies all the way until September. They're actually introducing a new benefit to kind of transition out of the wage subsidy that is focused on hiring more people and adding more hours. Those were all things you said that the budget missed the mark on, but they're actually in the budget.
A couple of months for new hires. They're almost Band-Aid solutions while the patient is bleeding. In fact, because Mr. Trudeau's been so slow on the vaccine rollout, we're going to see variants. We're going to see the pandemic extending well past the timelines for his new programs. And there's a lot of small businesses that are literally holding on by a thread now. So to make sure people are working and not dependent on CERB Forever or the UBI that the Liberals were promoting at their convention, we need to make sure we really save small business, particularly the main streets across the country. And then their attacks on the natural resource sector and working Canadians. We need to value whether people are working in the energy sector, in a small business. We need people back to work so that we can then have a plan to get the spending out of control. We just can't have hundreds of billions of dollars as far as the eye can see. So that's burdening debt on our children, and I think it's unfair and immoral, actually.
The deficit does go down over the next 5 years. I just want to quickly touch on one thing that you've echoed in most of your answers, and again ask you about the accuracy of it. I take your point that we have less vaccines in the United States. I think all Canadians understand the frustration there. But the government didn't promise in December to bring in 20 million vaccines. It promised 6 million in the first quarter, and it exceeded that. Why are you solely blaming the spread of variants and the situation so many provinces find themselves in now on the federal government, when provinces did have a heads up about what to expect, be that slow or not, and in many cases are being challenged right now on the idea that they didn't do enough to mitigate what was coming?
Mr. Trudeau had great fanfare in mid-December when he had some symbolic vaccines and photos. He refused to have a plan, refused to release the contract, still hasn't explained why he partnered with CanSino, a Chinese state enterprise, to be our vaccine partner. That fell apart. That's why we don't have a vaccine supply that didn't really pick up. And in fact, even the vaccines they delivered, they were a little late with at the end because they weren't distributed to the provinces. It's almost like they handed in their assignment 2 days after the cutoff. So Canadians want better. It is a crisis, but this is why we need leadership, and they've been 2 or 3 steps behind at every stage. It was the same with rapid tests. It was the same with PPE. It was the same at the border. There's been no leadership from Justin Trudeau throughout this pandemic.
Except I take your point on certain things you're putting across, except for example, on rapid tests or on vaccine doses. Eventually it came, right? There are millions of rapid tests now in the provinces. There have been millions of doses administered to the provinces. You don't ever sort of add the caveat that the provinces also have not used those rapid tests to the degree that they promised, right? Or that some provinces have issues administering vaccine doses that the feds have given to them. Again, I'm not absolving the feds of responsibility there, but you're not accurately portraying it.
A year ago, I asked for national leadership on testing nationally. We don't need to rely even on the provinces. These were approved by the Trudeau government 6 months late. They're diagnostic tests, they're not drugs. And then there should have been a rollout through the airports, through borders, and through large federal industries to set the standard. Should have been the same with tracing. I asked for that. The app, does Mr. Trudeau even talk about it anymore? It has failed on that level too. So the fact that we didn't have testing and tracing at levels we needed to has made some of the response to this short. And to deliver the tests to the provinces when they're already in the second wave of the pandemic, that was a failure as well. So I still think there's the opportunity for the federal government to have a national rolled out testing system. We're going to have variants percolating around for some time. We need leadership here, and the Prime Minister knows we'll support him if there's leadership that will help Canadians, but there's been an absence of leadership, and that's why I think at the appropriate time, Canadians deserve better.
So the provinces are absolved of any responsibility in those realms? I mean, the tests are there. They have been for months.
I've talked to people that actually said the federal government tried to slow down some of the innovation that the Creative Destruction Lab in Toronto and others were trying to bring to have a national screening program. In fact, some industries, some travel providers were pushing for a national screening process. I have a sister that lives in the UK. They have piles of tests at home, and their kids have to be tested twice a week to go to school. Where has been that national initiative to get these out, get them normalized, like many other countries have used? That should have been the federal government, which approves the test in the first place. So this is again example the federal government can lead and help the provinces, or put the provinces in the position they're in now, which is scrambling without vaccines.
I do take your point. I guess I would just note that I've spoken to we've had guests on the show from many industries who complain about the lag in the provinces as well. But I want to circle back to the budget because, of course, that's what was unveiled today, and something else specifically that you said, and that is around, you criticized the Liberals for not lowering taxes in this budget. Which taxes would a Conservative government lower?
Well, our fear with the spending is they're going to be raising taxes. They're already, through CMHC, looking at the equity in people's home. They're going to be raising taxes to service what one of your guests that I heard just before I came on, saying the tens of billions we're going to need in the next few years just to service the new debt they're putting on. These are huge risks. And so what we would like to see is for seniors and particularly working families, can we provide more relief as they've seen wages cut as a result of lower hours in the pandemic? So we'd like to see a focus on jobs, upward support for wages, and even relief for some people that are struggling, and saving small business. That's what I asked the Prime Minister to really show some leadership in when he asked for my comments on the budget, and that's why in the pandemic, when we were looking for that leadership, it was disappointing to see him miss it.
Respectfully, though, you have promised to, if you were in power, if you were forming government, to balance the budget over 10 years. My question was, which taxes would you lower if you think they should be lowered? Which are they?
Well, for families, for example, the Liberals can promise for the 9th time in recent memory for the Liberal Party of Canada, a national program for daycare, or you can actually work to provide direct support to all families, not leaving any out and not impinging on provincial jurisdiction. So these are the ways we can support families through either lower taxes or definite support, real support for childcare. We're not just going to oppose, we're also going to propose some ideas of our own with an amendment to the budget, but also with some ideas in the coming weeks and months.
So stay tuned for which taxes you'd lower?
Well, stay tuned on how we're going to tackle getting people back to work. I launched our Canada Recovery Plan at our convention, a 5-pillar plan that I think we need to secure a stronger future from everything from vaccines to mental health to jobs, and a plan to get back to balance over the next 10 years. Because it's not leadership to just pass unsustainable debt levels to the future when we know we will eventually see higher interest rates. There's concern already about inflation. So this is a very, very risky budget for the future of the next generation of Canadians.
Okay, Mr. O'Toole, I'm out of time. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland joins us here in Ottawa. Hi, Minister. Good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
Hi, Hi, Vashi. Good to see you too.
I listened to your interview with my colleague Rosemary a little while ago, and something you said really jumped out at me. You said that COVID has kind of opened our eyes, opened people's eyes to the necessity of things like a child care program, and that it has so disproportionately affected different groups of people in this pandemic. And I wanted to challenge you for a second on that point, because I was thinking back to 2015 when the NDP was proposing universal child care, when the NDP was proposing a federal minimum wage, a sort of floor for the minimum wage. And you specifically and your party were very critical at the time of that. You highlighted, for example, how difficult it would be to manage that financially, how difficult it would be to talk to the provinces or negotiate with the provinces. Do you look back now and wish that you had introduced these programs earlier, say 6 years ago, that could have helped us mitigate what now you say everyone's eyes are open to?
You know, Vashi, as a person, I don't spend a lot of time looking back. I really look forward. And what I said to Rosie, I really believe, which is on early learning and childcare in particular, I think that we are at a new and special and important moment as a country, a moment when there is a widespread appreciation of the necessity and of the real economic value of early learning and childcare. A lot of people have said to me today in interviews, wow, people have been talking about this for 50 years. Why do you think finally we're going to get it done as a country? And Vashi, I think there are two reasons. One, our government is totally committed to it, and we are putting a lot of money on the table. $30 billion over 5 years, $9 billion ongoing. But the even more important reason is I think Canadians have decided we together want to make this happen. So I think that's really important and really positive.
So basically the political will is there because things are worse now than they were 6 years ago. I mean, women were being left out of the workforce 6 years ago, too, because they didn't have affordable childcare.
Look, Vashi, I think it would have been great to start building a universal early learning and childcare system in Canada 50 years ago when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women first recommended it. And I remember so clearly my mother being one of the people who fought so hard to make that happen. So I wish it had happened then. But I do think that one of the consequences of COVID has been for, mothers have always known how hard it is to work if you don't have childcare set up for your kids. It's punishing. It's really, really tough. But one of the consequences of COVID has been more broadly, people have seen that. They've seen when daycares close, when schools close, parents can't work, and usually it's mothers who can't work. And we have seen a devastating drop in the participation of women in the labor force as a result. That is having economic consequences. And yes, I do think that's made a difference in sort of the broader appreciation in the country of how important this is as an economic policy. The other thing that I think has made a difference is what a great job Quebec has done. Quebec has really shown that this isn't just some progressive feminist fantasy, but that you can really do it, and that if you build high quality, affordable, accessible early learning and childcare, not only does it transform people's lives, but you actually really, really reap significant economic rewards.
Yeah, and I take that point, certainly, and I'm not trying to nitpick on the timeline here, but it's not just some random commission that recommended it. It's the Liberals who have been promising it for years. And also time is of the essence. Even in the plan you put forward today, right? This will happen over a period of 5 years. Do you have any, at this point, provincial buy-in?
I have had some conversations with provinces, and I think that now that we have put our plan out there, that we've put some money on the table, I look forward to continuing those conversations.
What happens with a province like Quebec or Newfoundland and Labrador, which already has subsidized daycare? Do you just kind of hand over a check and say you can do with this what you like?
Look, with each one of the provinces, we're going to have, and we will have good bilateral conversations. As you point out, every province and territory is different in how much they have done and in their ambitions in early learning and childcare. We really look forward to those conversations. For a province like Quebec or like Newfoundland that has already done a lot, this is really good news because we're saying the federal government is going to be there to support you, to work with you, to take on our share of the burden.
But does that mean more specifically that the money that you transfer to provinces for this will have to go to that program? Like I'm thinking of Quebec, for example, that the Bloc leader flagged. They already have the model program, but they're not going to be happy if other provinces get money for theirs and they don't get for theirs. So will there be like an envelope of cash for Quebec and they can just keep going with the program they have?
There will definitely be support for Quebec, 100%. In terms of the specifics of what the agreement is going to look like with each province, I'm not going to anticipate that because we have to have conversations with the provinces and territories. They know best what their own needs are and where they are. And that is particularly true of a province like Quebec that already has a system in place. But I really want to assure the people of Quebec that this is good news for you because it means that the federal government is going to be there to take on a share of this really, really important program.
Final question before I let you go, Minister. I know you have a number of other interviews. I wanted to ask about the big picture and the overall amount of money that's being spent, and in particular, how Canadians are to judge when and in which way that spending will be curbed down. In previous comments in the fall economic statement, you talked about fiscal guardrails, and in particular, for example, employment numbers might be a guiding light to say, oh, we don't need to spend quite as much. What I read through in this document, and I wasn't part of the lockup, so I've read as much as I can, though, doesn't seem to indicate anything that specific. And that leaves you vulnerable and leaves your government vulnerable to criticism, for example, from the Conservatives that you don't seem to have a very concrete, definite plan to offer Canadians about how the spending will eventually become more sustainable. Why isn't there something specific about a fiscal guardrail in this?
Vashi, this budget document, and it is 100% understandable that you haven't read the whole thing. It's very long. But this budget document itself offers a very concrete plan, very concrete reassurance to Canadians that what we are proposing is reasonable and sustainable and that we can afford it. Some key markers. In this budget, we show the debt to GDP ratio on a clear downward trajectory, going down to 49.2% in 25-26. That's important for Canadians to show this is sustainable and our debt is going down. A second really key marker is the deficit is going down too. And in 25-26, we project a deficit of 1.1%. Again, a clear downward track. On the various employment and unemployment and hours worked data points that we're using as a fiscal guardrail, we really put them in there to ensure that when we were looking at what we need to do, we were clear about the importance of jobs and getting Canadians back to work. And that really is just an overriding objective for me and for the government. We are 460,000 jobs short of where we need to be to have the same employment levels we had before COVID struck. That's a lot of Canadians who are suffering. And so, yeah, that guardrail has had a huge impact on us and has really been a driving imperative for me and for us to put together a plan that's going to get people back to work and is going to create jobs and growth for Canadians.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you, Minister Freeland. Appreciate your time as always. Let's get some more reaction to what's in this budget and perhaps what isn't from the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. He's here in Ottawa. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
Good to see you too.
Let me just ask you unequivocally, because you had signaled you would do so prior to the budget, will you be supporting this budget?
We're going to be very clear, given how bad the pandemic is, given the third wave, the ICU units that are being overrun in Ontario, record number of cases, field hospitals being set up, some of the poorest communities being the hardest hit with the lowest vaccination, it would be, as Canadians have said when asked the question, unsafe and unfair to Canadians to have an election. So we absolutely will not be triggering an election. It is a wrong thing to do. It would be, in fact, irresponsible to do.
So I completely understand that point. I think a lot of Canadians are understanding and in agreement with you on that. If I put that to the side for a second, there are things in this budget that you had called for, but there are also things not in this budget that you had specifically called for. For example, a wealth tax or money for pharmacare, a pharmacare program at all. There's none of that in here. Have you sort of handcuffed your ability to meaningfully oppose and push the government in that direction because you've so clearly stated that you would not vote against this budget in a matter of confidence?
Not at all. What we've seen throughout this pandemic is we were able to secure a lot of victories for people, doubling CER, bringing help to students, bringing in a paid sick leave, though it needs to be improved, and increasing the wage subsidy. All were able to be achieved without a budget vote. We fought during the legislation for any of these changes. There's also going to be additional legislation needed. They're going to need our support, and we'll be able to fight to make sure there's more help for people. We're not going to back down from that. And there's certainly a big question and a big problem that this Liberal government has presented. With this budget, the question that was on a lot of people's minds, who's going to pay for the pandemic? Who's going to pay for the recovery? Well, they answered that question really clearly, and they said it's not going to be the ultra-rich. Despite how much they gained in this pandemic, despite how much of their wealth has been increased, the ultra-rich will not be paying their fair share. The Liberals chose not to do that. Now it's a big mistake. We're going to continue to put pressure to say that has to change, and we want to see more help for people to get access to paid sick leave. We want to see more supports for people who need access to medication. There's lots that we need to do, and we'll keep on fighting for those things.
Let me just focus in on one of those, and that is the wealth tax that your party had proposed. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but when I look back at the initial motion, I think it was in late fall that your party had introduced, it talked about being able to raise about $5.6 billion a year. That is a tidy sum of money, but it certainly isn't even, it's about a sixth of what the cost of childcare is going to be. The spending is over $100 billion over 3 years. So it would really only make a small dent in the kind of spending that is being proposed. Is it really that much of a kind of magic elixir?
It's a significant increase in revenue, and the only party talking about significant increasing to revenue. And we had the Parliamentary Budget Office look at it, and they said if we tax the ultra-rich, if we close tax loopholes, if we made sure we put a tax on web giants and make sure they're paying their fair share, we could actually increase the revenue significantly beyond just the $5 billion that you cited. Even just the wealth tax alone, after a couple of years with increased attention to making sure there's compliance, we can get that up to $10 billion a year, according to the PBO. But there's additional measures. What we really need to see happen is a fundamental shift where we answer the question, who pays the cost for this pandemic and for the recovery? It shouldn't be workers. It shouldn't be families that have sacrificed so much. It shouldn't be small businesses that have been forced to close their doors and may never open again. It certainly should be the ultra-wealthy, the ultra-rich who have gained significant and substantial profits during this pandemic. The Amazons and Netflix and Googles of this world that make profits off the backs of Canadians but pay virtually no tax. The Galen Westons who have seen their corporate grocery stores make massive profits. They should be the ones paying their fair share. The Liberals chose not to do that, and that was wrong.
But it's not like they are adding additional taxes onto the list, for example, of quote unquote ordinary Canadians and workers and people who are managing or trying to make their way through this pandemic. There aren't additional taxes there, and there are taxes to address the digital environment as well. So are you accurately kind of, I guess, characterizing what they're doing here?
Yes, if you look at it, when it comes down to it, if we've come out of a pandemic and in this year, the richest Canadians, the 44 billionaires in Canada, increased their wealth by $62 billion. If after this budget, they're not going to have to pay anything significantly more, that's a mistake. That's wrong to do that. In this pandemic, we know there are some people that have been hard hit and there's some people that have actually benefited. Those that are at the very, very top, the richest Canadians, the ultra-rich, have benefited, and it is wrong not to take this opportunity to ask them to pay their fair share. That is wrong.
Before I let you go, Mr. Singh, just a question on a different topic, and of course one that I think is front of mind for many Canadians, and that is the pandemic. You wrote a letter to the Prime Minister calling on him and his government to employ the the Emergencies Act in order to address some of the situation, particularly in Ontario. I wanted to note that the situation in Saskatchewan and Alberta and BC is not quite where Ontario is, but it's certainly headed in a similar direction. Why did you only single out Ontario?
Right now, the response to the third wave in Ontario is a train wreck. Doug Ford, his response has been callous, and it has resulted in some of the poorest communities being the highest rate of infection and the lowest rate of vaccination. We've got field hospitals being set up and ICU units being overrun. Speaking to the healthcare workers, they are at their end. This is horrible what's happening. And so we're saying that there needs to be a public health emergency using that specific clause within the Emergency Act, which would give us the ability to get more people paid sick leave access, let people take time off to get vaccinated, and help direct the vaccines to the people who need it most. These are things that are vital and crucial. And right now in Ontario, we're seeing basically a catastrophe unfold. And that's the reason why we're calling for the Emergency Act to be used specifically in Ontario to get help to the people who need it most.
I wonder, though, for example, how you communicate that if you are the Prime Minister to leaders, to provincial leaders. I mean, they have very sternly and significantly throughout this pandemic asserted their authority. I talked to Premier Blaine Higgs earlier today, who was, open to maybe the idea of some vaccines moving elsewhere, but they are facing their own pressures from opposition parties in their provinces not to take vaccines away from their own citizens and move them elsewhere. I understand what you're saying about the public health argument for vaccinating those hotspots. I completely get it. But it's, is this really the way to do it? It's such a unilateral move.
Well, what's going on in Ontario requires some immediate action. Doug Ford has failed the people. It is horrible what's going on, and it is devastating to see the impacts. And the federal government can do a lot more, specifically with paid sick leave. With the Emergency Act tools, it would allow for payments, which could go directly to workers who take time off to get vaccinated or who can't go into work because they're sick. There's ways to help people out. And given how serious things are in Ontario, given the severity of the situation, it requires, at this point, a consideration of the Emergencies Act. And that's why we wrote that letter to the Prime Minister.
Okay, Mr. Singh, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Appreciate it, as always.
Thank you.
Let's get reaction to a lot of what's in that document from Anna May Paul. She's the leader of the Green Party, and she's with us from Toronto. Hi, Ms. Paul. Good to see you, as always. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Bashi.
The document is over 700 pages, so there is a lot to it. But I wanted to start off with a simple question, the same one I asked your counterpart in the NDP. Will you and your party be supporting this budget?
As you said, it's a very big document, and we didn't have a virtual lockup offered to us. So we're going to be digesting this just like the general public, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow when we speak as a caucus.
I had listened to your comments in advance of the budget, and you had been particularly focused on pandemic supports and the fact that this budget, though, it was signaled to be a lot about what a post-pandemic recovery was about, that it should be very focused as well, or if not, more so on what's happening right now in the pandemic. And there ended up being a lot in here to that effect. For example, an extension of the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, and the introduction of a new benefit to incentivize hiring and increasing hours as of this summer. Is that what you were looking for?
Well, we're looking to make sure that people in Canada are protected as much as possible until the very end of this pandemic. I'm sure that the government had hoped that conditions would be better by the time they introduced the budget, but we can see that they're not. I'm here in Ontario, so I'm living that firsthand. There still are some holes, and I think that this was the time to close them. We're going to keep pushing for it. There is a subsidy for rents for commercial tenants, but there isn't a subsidy for the low-income renters that are falling into arrears. There is no benefit for students that has been announced this summer, even though most students, post-secondary students, are going to be finishing school in May. But it was great, of course, to see that that grants and waivers have been extended. And, in terms of those benefits, Vashi, again, we're digesting the document, but I did notice that even though the benefits were extended until the fall, which is great, that the CRB is going to be reduced to $300 a week from $500 a week by July the 17th, I believe. So, we promised to be there, all of us, for as long as it took, and there's still some gaps. The people most at risk still are falling through the cracks, some of them. And so these are things that I had hoped to see in the budget and will continue to push for.
I know you said that those discussions among caucus are taking place now, but is there kind of a red line from your perspective as the leader of the party? Like those gaps that you highlight, are they enough to dissuade you from supporting the budget? Or did what they presented, does it on the face of it seem to you like enough of a step in the right direction?
So I'm really focused, I will say personally, again, not having spoken to the caucus, on the benefits related to the COVID response, because quite frankly, I don't have the confidence. I don't believe that the other promises, the long-term ones, are going to see the light of day within this session of Parliament. I would really like to believe that things like childcare, things like increased investments in other social programs that were announced today are important enough that the government would choose to work across party lines to keep this session of Parliament going. But I really think this was an election budget. So you'll forgive me if I don't want to spend the next couple of days or the next week talking about the Liberal platform for the 2021 election. I do think, though, that there is enough time for us to get these urgent emergency benefits to people to protect them during the pandemic, even if we do go to an election in the next 2 or 3 months. And so I really think that that's what we need to focus on. And I think every party can agree at least on that much.
Let me just quickly challenge you on the idea that this is all, that everything that they've posited for the future is about an election. I obviously, it's a political show. I get that for sure. But a lot of what they proposed had been called for, like a long-term universal childcare program, like some of the investments in the green economy. Was it not incumbent on them to signal what might happen in the future, what kind of direction a Liberal government would take the country in? And won't it be incumbent on other parties like yours to do the same? Is it as politically crass as you might be making it out to be?
Well, I know I don't want to suggest that it was crass at all. What I would say is that there's over 2 years left in this session of Parliament, in theory. If the Liberal government wants to see these, some of the important, and in the case of childcare, historic policies that they've proposed in this budget see the light of day, then they can and should be working with other parties toward it. We've done some extraordinary things in the past with minority governments. There is no need to have an election this year. And so, given that, I definitely, our party definitely is a party that says very clearly when we're in agreement, we look for areas of collaboration. So we support childcare. We support long-term care reform. We support many of the social programs that the Liberals and their grassroots support. So I would love to see the Liberal government say, hey, let's keep this session of Parliament going long enough so that we can actually make sure that childcare is a reality, and let's not risk it in an election. So I'm all for that and ready to collaborate anytime. But if they don't do that, then really this is just their platform for the next election, and that's fine. But I'd rather talk about the things that we can do while this session of Parliament is going on and while we're still in the and given the needs of the pandemic.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ms. Paul. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you, Vashi.
Thanks a lot. Annamie Paul is the leader of the Green Party. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.